Again, my name is Josh Joseph. My background was originally in clinical informatics and engineering, but got kind of moved closer and closer to operations due to interest in questions of throughput, analysis, and I found its pull has been continuous, even though it has not always been a totally easy journey. I have no disclosures. I have one small child, so if you have any bribes or sources of additional income, I'm very interested in hearing about them. So I'm going to attack this from a number of different angles, and it's not simply because we're an academic emergency medicine group that we have to do research, but the question of research within operations is one that sometimes can seem antithetical to our ends. A lot of times operations is the business of getting things done, and it is very easy to see things from the perspective of we act pragmatically, we do what works, and if we manage to get a paper out of it at the end of the day, that's okay, but maybe secondary to most of our goals. I'm going to cover why it is so difficult to do good operations research in EM, some basic study designs, some more advanced areas of study, again, not necessarily something that you're going to use as an off-the-shelf tool, but to kind of have a sense of technology that's out there, and also to talk just very generally about where the field is going. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's worked pragmatically, with caveat that what works at one institution may be completely different than that at another institution. So again, the kind of larger question of why we need to do research for operations is a fundamental one to our daily practice, either as physicians or as administrators. I think most of us have had, at some point in our career, a moment where we really had to decide what was clinically the important thing to do and what was the right thing to do for the department. Again, it's not as though we always can see worst first. A lot of times there are areas of gray between what is clinically salient and what will get the department moving. Should I see the sickest patient first? Should I get the person who I can get out the quickest first? It would seem to be straightforward, but in terms of how you're managing nursing resources, how you're managing your time, it's an operational question that each of us works through on shift every single time we come to work. And we can also find ourselves wondering, why aren't things moving faster? I mean, certainly we get more than enough complaints from our patients that they hate waiting. We hate waiting for our tests to come back. Is there a way that we can really move the department in a way that's better? And that fundamentally, to me, is why we do operations research, not necessarily because we're chasing some grand academic prize. Lord knows most of us will probably not be chasing grant funding in the way that people who are in basic or clinical science are doing. But at the same time, if you fail to measure these outcomes, it's very hard to make any meaningful change. And it's very easy for a lot of people to have opinions on how to fix operational problems in the emergency department. Now, as a field, operations research in emergency medicine is pretty underdeveloped. We don't have a lot of standardized structures for study designs within operations. There are ways in which we often will cram things into an observational model, even though this is not necessarily the best model for a change we're trying to make. Similarly, we have guidelines for doing sort of quasi-experimental studies, but they often aren't necessarily good fits for operational changes. Trying to determine whether somebody had an MI or not is a very basic question. Trying to determine if we had a meaningful change in door to EKG times when you may be talking about seconds or variations that can be explained just by days of the week can be very, very hard to get across to an audience of folks who are very phased to look at outcomes. And again, it seems like we ought to be doing an awful lot more research. We have tons of data sources within the ED when it comes to operations. Certainly, if you work with Epic, if you work with Meditech, if you work with PowerChart or Cerner, almost everything that you do in terms of patient care is being logged somewhere. There's a wealth of timestamp data, And it's really on us to make the best of what we have with them. Then again, there's very little that we know about emergency care that is meaningfully documented. And that's not to say that people aren't trying to make measurements here. I mean, certainly the EU Benchmarking Alliance and other groups have, I think, made hay of really trying to quantify a lot of things that we take for granted. But the problem is that for the most part, there isn't the same sort of open lines of communication about many really basic things about how our field works, especially when it comes to those critical questions of weights, of throughput. Again, I had a really smart resident come up to me, very interested in doing operations research, and she point blank asked me, okay, how many patients per hour should I be seeing? Now again, like I think we all during our residency education basically compared ourselves and said, am I really going fast enough? And she was like, no, can you, from a granular standpoint, tell me how many patients on a Monday a first-year resident is supposed to be seeing? I had no answer to this question. I can kind of guess. I can take a look at some of those trends. Okay, so, fine. How many minutes should my H&P be taking? Like, how much faster am I going to get by the time I'm attending? I have no answer to this question. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, it depends, okay? Is this person coming in with chest pain or an ankle sprain? Do they speak English as a primary language? These are all things that are going to influence that. But there's no objective measure I can give. There's no benchmarking standard that I can apply to. I know the door to EKG time better be 10 minutes or less, or ideally 5 minutes or less, but I can't tell you that you ought to be in and out of the room in any span of time. And we have extremely little information on any of these things, or even what is safe for any of these quantities. I mean, again, I think my residents can handle an awful lot of sore throats and ankle sprains. I don't know how many belly pains and how many chest pains I can really expect them to juggle during any one point in the shift. So, kind of my own personal journey from this is this question of how many patients per hour should a resident see per shift has basically become the last 7 years of my life on account of that. And that's been my kind of entree into doing operations research. And so from one simple question that the resident had asked me, I've basically branched out into many other questions that are really kind of answering the same fundamental thing. So at least, I will not claim that I've revolutionized the field by any means, but when I actually went to look and see, can I give a resident an answer to this question, I found that basically this was the state of the science in terms of how many patients per hour a resident sees. I have never met a resident who falls first year of training, second year of training, third year of training into those top two lines on the graph. I mean, maybe like working in urgent care, can I consistently expect a resident to see 2 patients per hour every single hour of their shift? But that's just fundamentally, at any of the sites I've worked with residents, not how they're built. And that's not to say that on average, they don't necessarily see this number of patients. But in actuality, the curves of patients that they see look a whole lot more like this. And the explanation for this actually makes a fair amount of sense when you show up to work. So ultimately, most of the residents who are eager to be at work come in with a full rack like gangbusters. They will often sign up for 3 or 4 patients, possibly before they've seen their first patient of the shift. And then suddenly that seeming productivity dies down. And the reason is that even though their H&Ps may be fairly brief, they're taking orders, eventually they have to catch up to the work that they've already assigned themselves. Now there are definitely fluctuations within this, and not every resident follows the same exact pattern. But the problem is that when you start to imagine a paradigm where a resident can move at a constant rate, you end up with huge gaps in the amount of coverage that you actually have during a single shift. Again, it may well be, I don't have the funding or the wherewithal to do a study where I actually force a resident to see 2 patients per hour every hour. I don't think logistically it's really feasible at most EDs. But I can tell you that most of the capacity planning that we've done over many years has still followed that paradigm. And again, if you think about the way that we do work, there's a clear explanation for this, which is we tend to pipeline a lot of what we do. I know that in the patient workup, if it takes an hour to see a patient, very little of that time is actually time I'm spending in the room with the patient. It is time either wrestling with my EHR or waiting for those results to come back, and all of that time is very much asynchronous with the time that I'm actually spending with the patient. My juggling goes on during this mix, and I'll admit, if I'm single coverage or double coverage in an ED, I'm going to just keep seeing patients until I can't anymore, because I have to deal with something that came from one of the workups I'm already been doing. I'm presented with, hey doc, that CT scan is back, those labs are back, hey, the patient's still having pain, should we admit them? And that's ultimately my rate limiting step. So ultimately, even though most of my studies on this topic have been at one ED, if we don't know the answers to such basic questions, it's really very hard to actually say anything meaningful about how I can tell another ED to structure their shifts. If I don't know the answers to these basic questions, I'm never going to be able to answer how we can best schedule emergency physicians throughout the day, how many residents we ought to have when attending, how the heck we can load balance a team of physicians. And ultimately, the reason why we don't have good statistics on this is because operations research is extremely heterogeneous. Again, patients may or may not be like snowflakes, but depending on where you work, the EHR you use, the people you work with, and the culture around your practice, looking at patients as individual units is extremely messy. It doesn't matter if you can talk about chest pain patients in particular, there's going to be incredible variability from one location to another, even in the same zip code. Comparatively, our friends who are kind of working purely within the clinical research domain have it a lot simpler. Again, I'm not saying that it's easy to do an RCT, but I can say that you can say an RCA lesion is probably like other RCA lesions, even if they're on the other side of the country. And then finally, operational data is inherently siloed, no matter how you look at it. For example, this is a map of a very small area in Boston. That's where I worked of as of last week. That's where I work of as of about 2 weeks from now. It is the closest level 1 trauma center. And it's about 1,500 to 1,600 feet, depending on if you cross the street at the light, if you get coffee in between. There's not all that much research coordination because these two hospitals are part of different networks. Then again, depending on the outcome that you're looking at, there can be some coordination. To share between these two hospitals how many patients we gave clopidogrel versus whatever the new 2B3A inhibitor that cardiology is asking for is a really easy ask. Asking for the number of work RVUs that were generated by their department between July and August, that's an impossible ask, unfortunately. And that is one of the big structural challenges that we face. Additionally, funding is a huge issue. And again, this tends to be a self-perpetuating problem. We have ARC, we have NIH, but most of those organizations will fund something that is specifically disease-based. You may get an operational study funded if you can say, I plan to treat MI and I want to improve the door to EKG time. But even though I might be able to save plenty of lives by turning the turnaround time down by 2 minutes, if I could save 2 minutes per patient, I could get the ED to hum. The government will never fund that. Similarly, a lack of how operations research works tends to be a real error and a real kind of stumbling block for many of us in the field. Again, most of the people who are reviewing studies of an operational nature that go to emergency medicine journals aren't in operations themselves. And it's not to say that they couldn't understand the design, but if one of the criteria you have for a good study, for a study that is worthy of one of these journals, is it really ought to be an RCT, you're already in big trouble. I will say, having done SAEM abstract grading for many years, study design plays directly into the number of points your abstract gets. The number of operations method studies that can be done as a randomized double-blind control trial is very close to zero. So again, I don't know that that's necessarily something bad about the criteria, but it suggests that operational research probably needs a different standard or set of standards through which we can research it. Again, most of these changes are not ones that people can ever be blinded to. If you're telling nurses or doctors that they're going to be coming in at 7 a.m. or 7 p.m., it's a little bit hard, say for kidnapping people or blindfolding them, to actually blind any of this. Again, it's also not necessarily safe to make many of these implementation changes in a way that you could actually cover up. If you had an EHR tab that only worked half of the time, well, you could say that the study was blinded, but most of the folks would think that you instead just have a broken EHR. And then finally, sometimes trying to publish these studies can really seem like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. And that is really just a measure of what kind of research gets done in emergency medicine. I won't claim that this is like a totally accurate picture, but I'm not claiming that this is more or less representative of what a lot of research in emergency medicine looks like. Again, whether we did ultrasound to X, Y, or Z is an important question, don't get me wrong. It's just one that we seem to ask pretty damn often. And again, this is okay. This is what we build graduates in our field to be interested in, and it's also what we give them the research background to understand. Unfortunately, it's not one that really overlaps with a lot of operations research. Now, again, operations research writ large, if you're going to go get a PhD in operations, covers an awful lot of this stuff that is just, it's not part of our education. And that's okay. I'm not suggesting that everybody go out and take, a stochastic methods class. I don't think I would survive one. But for the most part, the experts in research within our fields, these are folks who are the epidemiologists most often, and statisticians that we have and are employed by our departments and by our journals, cover exactly one of these areas. Whereas people who are in formal operations research, people who get Starbucks to run that much faster, people who are able to get, I guess I'm very hungry, Dunkin' Donuts to run their operations a little bit better, cover a much different spectrum of research, and that's why a lot of this does not fit. Again, being able to draw these sorts of correlations can be very difficult when the methodology that most of us are primed to look at from most clinical research is at regression, when very commonly the tools that you need is to actually be able to look at different groupings of patients or clinicians within the operations space. And fundamentally, again, I'm not joking when I say that gatekeepers within clinical research don't really understand what we're trying to achieve with operations research. So to harken back to looking at physician productivity. So I redid the study looking at residents a few years later at 3 different community hospitals we're affiliated with. So basically just trying to say again, do attending physicians see a static number of patients per hour? Is this average actually credible? Spoiler alert, it was really similar to residents. Again, you think you mature as a doctor, operationally you may not. And in submitting to the same journal that accepted the paper about residents, again, I thought this was really fairly straightforward. I took one study that got accepted, was a single center retrospective study, did a prospective study, 3 different hospitals. The response was, we're not going to accept this paper because the productivity of individual physicians does not matter to the emergency department. The person who wrote this, who shall remain nameless, was not an emergency physician. Again, I can say to the health system writ large, this may be a totally reasonable thing to say. I can say in terms of whether your emergency department survives or does not, this is as wrong as I can possibly imagine. So there are other options. You can certainly publish outside of the main emergency medicine literature, but one of the issues with this is that when I go to talk about kind of the background that somebody who has a PhD in operations research has, you're suddenly trying to describe stuff that is like banging rocks together by comparison to how operations works in many other industries. And again, that's not to say that there isn't good operations research done in healthcare. There is. It's just stuff that clinicians are largely not involved in. It's stuff that's done at the healthcare system level. So, lest this seem like some total Jeremiad where I'm saying it's hopeless to do operations research. It's not. It's more a matter of trying to be smart and trying to figure out how you're going to get the square peg whittled down to the round hole. So I'm going to transition and talk about some of the basic study designs, and some of this may seem really basic, but how you can fit an operational question into many of these studies is what may determine whether you can meaningfully turn your operational work into research or not. So again, observational studies, they are relatively straightforward. For many of us in operations, this is pretty much the realm that most of our studies are going to be in. We have access for the most part, whether it's through QI databases, payer databases, or just the shoe leather work of looking at a lot of notes. It's very easy to get approved, even provisionally, to do a QI study that you can then convert to a research study. And these are really important. These are, again, what is going to give you the baseline of how long do our patients spend in the emergency department? How long is that clinician workup going to take? And it's one that you can at least get people who are more from that public health background to kind of grok. Similarly, a lot of the times we can't run a formal randomized controlled trial, but when we make an operational intervention, we can look at, we added another nurse in triage, we added a physician in triage. You may not necessarily be able to say, okay, well, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we're going to have this new setup, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, we're going to have the old way. Although that is a reasonable way for trying to semi-randomize thing. But just taking a set of representative measurements and trying to match some of your patients, trying to say, okay, looking at equal proportions of the chest pain patients that came in before and after this intervention, was there a difference? And one aspect that I think people in the education research field have totally nailed down that we in operations have not is actually qualitative interviews. Now again, this is like getting more into like the domain of sociology, anthropology, but for the uninitiated, a qualitative interview study basically is one where you're trying to assess a group of stakeholders' responses to something within the environment. Again, this may be part of the groundwork you do before you take an operational change. You're trying to improve triage, and it may be that orders aren't being done from triage, and the nurses you work with may have latitude to order labs. What you can do is you can sit down with them and basically say, hey, we're hoping you guys could order more of these labs for workup for patients who are waiting in the waiting room for X amount of time. What are the barriers to you being able to make those orders? And it may be something as simple as, it'd be a lot easier if I had a chest pain order set that I knew the physicians would agree on. Because again, maybe it's not clear, hey, this doctor gets pissed off if I ever order troponin without asking first. And I don't want to step on those toes, or I don't want to take that initiative, for fear that if it turns out it's a patient with chest pain who we're not even doing a cardiac workup on, now I have this troponin kind of hanging out there. But you're never going to get that input unless you do the asking. What a qualitative interview method basically does is it formalizes that process in a way that not only helps you ask the right questions, but actually helps you guide your decision making, and also can be legitimate research in the process. Because again, even though the implementation of that process at your ED may be a little bit different from one that, say, has a bigger waiting room or has a different system of triage nurses, the actual steps that you take to do those interviews to address those concerns may actually be really important for somebody else's implementation of the same system. I will say, however, it's a lot of work. And to do this sort of study right, you've got to have a team of people within your group who is willing to take the time and willing to actually transcribe literally everything that you're talking about in these interviews. Time and motion studies is, again, this is like a bread and butter technique of if you're anywhere in a service industry figuring out how to improve operations. And this is following somebody around with a stopwatch and actually charting how much time they spend in different parts of a task. Now, if you guys happen to use Epic, which is an increasing proportion of emergency physicians, there are actually tools within Epic that are taking very careful notes in terms of how much time you are spending in your notes, how much time you're spending searching, which quick phrases you guys are using, and again, like, it's a little bit Big Brother-ish, but it's also the way that things are moving. And at a minimum, since this is definitely a technology or set of technologies that's here to stay, it's one that you can really make use of. And again, it is a perfectly legitimate source of data for if you make a change in your emergency department, no matter how small, to be able to say, okay, once we added these order sets at triage, we spent 5 minutes less in orders for clinicians across our group. Again, there's a whole bevy of systems. I'm not going to totally bowl you guys over again, but there are multiple frameworks you can use that are also reportable and study designs. It's just a matter of understanding how you document your process and keeping good notes so that when you start trying to reform an area of your ED, you have something that is reproducible for an outside auditor and for you to actually write up. Now I'm going to make just a brief transition. I'm going to fly through these really fast, but there are some more advanced techniques that folks who are in the operations world writ large tend to use. These are not things that you're necessarily going to do yourself by picking up a program and just getting go, but if you are at a university and you have a business school or school of engineering, I can guarantee you that there are people who know how to use these tools and who may be very eager for work on their thesis, for work to show that they're providing university service, but can really help you to kind of get engaged with these very advanced designs. So a queuing analysis. A queuing analysis is an extremely standard method within most industries within the United States. I don't care if you're Starbucks, American Airlines, Amazon, all of these companies use queuing analyses. And again, it's not necessarily that anybody would expect you to do one of these analyses on your own, but it's a matter of knowing that these tools are out there. So what this can do is can kind of help to illustrate where breakdowns happen during these different systems within your ED. And the example that I really love to go over is actually triage. So this may be upsetting. I know I said there'd be no math. There's going to be like a little bit right now. So I think we can agree 60 minutes in an hour. Your theoretical ED has 10 patients per hour who come in, and you have a very experienced triage nurse who we can guarantee is like a robot, can just see a patient in 6 minutes. Can we have one nurse see all the patients and have none of them wait? Is this a trick question? So if reality works somewhat like this, and patients come at nice, regular 6-minute intervals, we are doing okay. Unfortunately, even if I went back to all those constraints and said, we will always get 10 patients per hour and it only takes 6 minutes to see them, patients do not coordinate their visits, and unfortunately, there is no law out there that constrains any of those arrivals to come in any sort of well-behaved fashion. And inherently, what ends up happening is that at some point, whenever we're waiting for a patient to be seen, that robot nurse is losing time in that capacity, and at the same time, if two people show up in overlapping segments, we've lost time, and there is no way that the robot nurse can catch up. So, without going again too much into the math, as you start to match arrivals closer and closer with the amount of time you can turn them around, the likely amount of time that people are going to wait keeps going up. The closer and closer you get to that 1-to-1 ratio of utilization. And to be very hand-wavy about this, there is a magic line around 80% utilization where waits go from being small but tolerable for most people to being out of this world. And again, we're not the only people to use this. If you've ever been at Starbucks and gotten too tired with a line, somebody out there has done an equation
of how likely you are to give up, the formal term is balking at a line, and how much most people are willing to tolerate that wait, and the number of servers who are on, provided there's not been a huge strike that day or the metro isn't running, is probably determined by that number. And again, it's not as though this hasn't been done. Linda Green, she's an administrator out of Columbia Business School, did a really awesome version of this back in the mid-2000s. It has yet to be replicated, where she basically did this same exact sort of analysis, looking at individual physician productivity, moved a staffing schedule to match up with kind of when those arrivals were, and managed to cut waiting times dramatically. And again, this is not something you need great math skills to do. There are simulation analyses that can do this for you. It's a matter of being able to engage with the right partners to use these tools. Now, simulation analysis, most of the sim tools do not actually look like this. I think this is like Sim Hospital or Theme Hospital. But basically, once you have these basic data points together, can be a next step for any sort of operational change you're going to make. And again, with those different industries, whether it's the airlines, your coffee shop, what have you, a lot of times behind the scenes, this is what's going on. Simulations are being run over and over again before they actually make that step of adding that extra server at 5 p.m. And there's a whole host of different methodologies that can be used. Again, for our purposes, it's not really important what the differences are, but just to know that there are an awful lot of different tools out there. Again, you usually need either tech skills or some money to hire somebody with tech skills to do this, even though these are like really widely used tools. But if you happen to have a university affiliation, these people are out there and they're often willing to work for free. Again, there is precedent for their use within the emergency department. It's just that a lot of times these are one and done studies. Very few people have been able to build off of these, and I don't know if it's a matter of access or interest. If you are so inclined, I do have an open source tool that does a lot of these things. Currently, you do need to be able to use Python to do it, but I am working on a web version where you can just plug things into your phone. If you go to edq.org, there's like a very basic version of that calculation out there that you can play with. There are other really complex techniques that are out there. Linear programming is one of them. It can help you with resource allocation. Again, this is something that you generally will need like somebody who's got a PhD to run. But when it comes time to trying to make a pitch of, well, we really need another EKG machine, there are methods like this that can help you come up with a formal cost analysis, again, depending on who's making that approval. Another one is constraint satisfaction. I'm not going to jump too far into the weeds because we're running low on time here, but if you use MetricAid or QGenda or any of these scheduling programs, this is actually what's going on within the guts of the system. Basically, it is a system of basically being willing to say there are certain red lines we won't cross for trying to fit the schedule together. And there are an awful lot of different scenarios that this can actually be used well beyond scheduling. So to just breeze through very quickly kind of where research is going, there are a lot of areas of very hot interest within operations research. And I'm just going to really fly through these. Point-of-care testing. And forgive me if I sound like I'm on the cutting edge of 2004 medicine. A lot of these things are things that keep coming up because they're good ideas. They're just often not implemented in a way that's always sustainable. Point-of-care testing is one that is just perennially on the edge of happening. Again, folks may use an iStat, you may use a portable creatinine device. A lot of times this is one that kind of conflicts a lot with laboratory reporting standards. I have in the past couple of years worked at a couple different sites, some of which have portable creatinine meters, some of which don't. And basically, the utility of point-of-care testing comes down to what your lab turnaround times are and what your use cases are. So very commonly, if you need a creatinine to get contrast approved, there is a way to justify doing point-of-care testing. However, if you have so much demand on your CT scanner that even with that turnaround time being within minutes, you're still going to wait hours for a CT, it becomes very hard to justify. But most of the successful uses of point-of-care testing for improving things almost always goes behind a protocol. Along those same lines, nursing protocols are, for many shops, a love it or hate it kind of proposition. Again, simply having like a one-size-fits-all chest pain pathway can be very difficult, but for a lot of low-hanging fruit, whether it's a matter of ordering x-rays from triage for your Ottawa ankle patients, can really speed things up, again, depending on if you have long wait times or not. Similarly, the doc in triage or PA in triage or resident in triage tends to hinge a lot on what your wait times are like. Similarly, if you have a large number of patients who are left without being seen, this is technically a way of putting your thumb on the scale. A patient who has been seen by a doc in triage by certain metrics has not left without being seen if they get fed up and left because they were seen at triage. Now again, if you have a large community site where you've got waits that are within hours, this can be a real game changer. But for a lot of smaller community shops, the cost of having another physician in triage often doesn't actually pan out. Similarly, having somebody who's potentially either a mid-level or resident often gets into some of the same issues with resource utilization that nursing workflows do too. If your resident is going to order a troponin on every patient with chest pain, that may be good if that's what the attending practice pattern is, but in terms of a cost-saving measure or an efficiency measure, it's one that your physicians need to be backing wholeheartedly. And again, the same thing goes for if you're willing to put an attending out there. Now, in terms of where we're going in terms of measures of throughput and productivity, I don't know about your ED, but my ED about 5-6 years ago went through a complete dezoning. And dezoning made an awful lot of sense because we'd have zones that were completely backed up, where we'd have a group of physicians that were completely siloed off from another area of the ED. And again, there's like a good queuing theory basis for this. Like, it makes sense for the most part if there are resources, if there are physicians who are not in use, you're wasting that capacity if they're not able to see people. But what we found when we dezoned our ED was, although we made physicians significantly more efficient, we made nurses a lot less efficient. And that was because those same nurses who had things relatively focused from a geographic standpoint were now running across the ED trying to track down the resident who was seeing the ankle sprain on one side of the ED and managing a patient with septic shock and putting in a line on the other. Again, going back to the original scenario, is a person with belly pain someone we ought to see before the ankle sprain? I don't know, but I can definitely say that that resident shouldn't be interrupting the line to discharge the patient with a negative ankle films. That having been said, is the emergency department going to flow better on account of the fact that they saw the ankle pain patient first? It's hard to say, and this is why a lot of the studies have not really shown a strong trend one way or the other. And again, studies which have looked at trying to remove the physician element have shown some progress, particularly in rotational patient assignment. Now, this was done over at Mayo most prominently, where basically it's kind of like one of those, there's no fancy computer algorithm behind it. It's like at a deli counter where you're literally just taking tickets to see, who comes next. Basically, you have, say, 3 docs on, a patient comes in, they come to the first doctor, the second patient goes to the second doctor, and so forth, and you just keep rotating around. You just don't wait for somebody to take a chart out of the rack. It is a surprisingly efficient way of doing things just because it gets at a lot of the issues that have come up in other studies of productivity. And again, so just to go very quickly, social loafing is the fact that we tend to slow down a lot when we're working with colleagues, not necessarily because we're chatting, but because when there's another patient in the rack, we all have this kind of subconscious sense of, well, hey, I just picked up a patient, maybe my colleague is going to pick this one up next. And there's kind of like a little race to the bottom until suddenly those charts start piling up. Cherry picking is that just amplified when there are certain patients that you maybe don't want to see based on their chief complaint, and that just kind of turns up the willingness to say, okay, maybe my colleague is going to see the other patient up to 11. We did a study at BI on certain chief complaints and whether they require an invasive exam and whether it takes the residents that much longer to sign up for the patients. I think you guys can probably guess which chief complaints got seen a lot slower and which genders of providers saw those patients much slower. I will leave it at that. Batching is again kind of what I was describing residents doing at the beginning of shifts, coming in saying I can see 3 patients. You have a gung-ho resident come in, they sign up for 4 patients, and then the 2 residents who are a little bit slower now have 0 patients to see. So there are ways, there's a study out of KU that's like looking at this right now, but these are some of the future directions that looking at productivity is going to go. I am starting to run way over on time, but simply willing to say that in terms of other areas that people are looking to make a lot of movement within operational research is looking at other ways to do observation care, whether that's within the ED or potentially dispositions home with some either monitoring or follow-up, as well as ideas of changing the care environment. Again, while dezoning is still in vogue for right now, the idea of creating things like discharge lounges, creating areas where you can have essentially ambulatory care through the ED are areas that I think people within this room may be innovating in. So, since I am way over on time, if there are any questions, I'm happy to field them, but we may just transition into our next talk.